Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video, I'm going to be going through my 10 favorite movie soundtracks. And that is being pulled, as I have been doing recently, from my CD and record collection that we have behind me. Now, of course, many years ago, I did a video called The 10 Greatest Film Soundtracks of All Time, and I was very objective, but I didn't necessarily own all the albums for those soundtracks. I knew they were great soundtracks. I thought they were well composed, very influential, and that was my objective list. More recently, I've been delving into my actual albums. Now, every morning when I turn up to the studio, now I've got my CD and records all together, my listening habits have changed, because rather than just sticking something on Spotify as I was before, not really enjoying it, I'm coming over to here and picking an album out. Now, over the last 40 years, what has motivated me to go and buy an album of a soundtrack, especially if it was a film I really liked, so I've got it on DVD or video cassette in the old days, so I can listen to it in the context of the film, and for me, that's the best place to listen to soundtracks. So it has to have a certain aspect to it for me to want to then take that music out of the context of the film and have it on an album that I can listen to as I would listen to an album. Because often with film soundtracks, for a film soundtrack to work, it has to have something slightly missing from the musical panorama to allow for the story and the visuals to come through. A lot of the great film soundtracks, when you analyse them, they work within the context of the film, but not necessarily on their own as a standalone piece of music. So I've been going through my record collection and pulling out some of the soundtrack albums I've got, and then I've brought them together and sort of identified 10 that I think if I was just to keep 10 of them, this would be the ones I would be keeping. This is all this stuff where I delve into the old record collection. It's a little bit like Desert Island Discs. And if you don't know what that is, that's a TV show. It's the radio show, sorry. It's the longest running radio show in history. It started off in the 1940s on BBC, and it was where a celebrity would come on and they would pick their 7 albums or records that they would keep if they were washed up on a desert island. They're the ones that they would want to be washed up with them. Thus being the sort of originator for all of us here on YouTube doing our top 10, lists, because that is where it started with old Roy Plumley. Now, I'm 2 minutes and 42 seconds into this video, and I think it's about time to get on with the list, because everyone accuses me of rabbiting on. So I'm going to go and get stuck in. These are my 10 favourite film soundtrack albums from my collection. Some of them are very famous, some of them are quite... But you're padding it out again, you're building it up there where they want to know. Well, the first one's probably the weirdest choice I've got at number 10. And it is this album. Koyaanisqatsi from the films. Now, this album itself is pretty old. And it was manufactured by the Gramophone Company Limited, Dum Dum in India, and it offers a whole bunch of Koyaanisqatsi from various Indian films from the 1940s and 50s. It's a very old album. I will show you the label because it's quite an interesting little record here. There we go. Now, a lot of my records I've inherited from my dad, but my mom, who was born in India and is half Indian and arrived in the UK in 1946, brought with us some stuff that they had when they were in India. Now, I think this was actually bought in the 1950s. There is a line to Indian culture and Indian music in my family. And for me, being an avid music fan and going through my parents' record collection as a kid, I would pull all these records out and they influenced me greatly. And without doubt, the strangest of them was this one. My mom also had, and I think I've lost it, I've just had a look for it. It wasn't a film soundtrack album. It was actually some Indian classical ragas for voice, and it was a bass voice. And this is the weirdest album that my parents had in their collection. As a kid, I would put it on and listen to this guy sort of going, and all this. What the hell is this? A whole side of this. This is a collection of Koyaanisqatsi, which are basically, they're like folk songs that they were incorporated into Indian films that then obviously developed into the whole Bollywood thing. And then when this sort of Indian and Pakistani immigrants came to the UK via Idi Amin, they brought with them this love of the films, and then in the areas where they lived, you would get sort of Indian video shops. And out of that sprung the Bhangra scene. Now, the Bhangra scene was basically sort of Western rock bands mixed with Indian percussion, the dol and the dolak. And these bands would play qawwalis, but they would play them in a more rocky or late on a more dance music way. When I lived in Wolverhampton, I, being a musician at the time, hooked up with a Bhangra band called Geet the Mega Band, and I played for them for a couple of years, appearing on the radio. Geet the Mega Band were one of the big Bhangra bands, and this was my first taste of playing in a band that did big gigs. It was my first taste of being on a band that had a record label and put albums out that would turn up to the BBC and do sessions for the BBC. And I also worked with the guys from DCS. They had a studio out in Birmingham, and I did a lot of work from there. And so this here is the beginning of my fascination with Indian culture, Indian music. It's gone all the way through. The artists on here: Noor Jahan, Lata Mangeshkar, Asha Bhosle, and Shamshad Begum. I know none of these people. The male qawwalis have been rendered by the foremost qawwali Ismail Azad and Modi Rafi, assisted by Manaday and SD Batish. Right, so that's where we start. This is a soundtrack album. I would sit there quite bemused by it. And that, as a young age, was where that influence starts to come in. And your ears are starting to tune to something different. Wonderful. Now, at number 9, I've got an album from a film which I have watched, and is a very hard watch, to be honest. And it's not a well-known film. You can't go and find it, although I think somebody has put a version of this film up on YouTube, broken into bits, filmed off their TV. It's quite an obscure film about a Mongolian shaman taking on a young acolyte and training them up. And the film is quite interesting in that it explores the mysticism of that, but from a very realistic point of view. So it's a really interesting film. It's heavy going. But of course, anybody who watches this channel will know that I have one of my favourite artists is John McLaughlin, and he supplied the soundtrack to that film. So of course I had to go and buy it. And this album, I feel, is one of John McLaughlin's best albums from the period when he was working with Trilot Gertu and Koyaanisqatsi and then Dominic DiPiazzi. And it's this album here. It's called Molam, as you can see. There it is. The Legend of Mongolia, music by John McLaughlin, and traditional Mongolian songs featuring Trilot Gertu. Now here on this, we have all sorts of really interested to hear John McLaughlin forging little musical interludes and full-scale musical compositions for a film. To put the virtuosity there, although it's still there to a certain point, and really explore melody. And there's always this thing with John McLaughlin, because he plays such a high speed and it's very complex. There's a certain element of the music listening public that find his stuff a little bit difficult, off-putting, too virtuoso, too technical. There's a couple of albums I would direct them to, and this is one of them. It also has a version, although it's not listed down here, of John McLaughlin playing one of his greatest melodies of all time, which is Lotus Feet. Now, I don't feel Lotus Feet has ever been properly recorded, because the one that appears on the first Shakti album fades out just as the actual tune's coming in. That's just a jam, really. And then it crops up on Inner Worlds, the last Mahavishnu Orchestra album, where it's given a very sort of metronomic and sort of unsubtle version. I've never been keen on that version. There is a beautiful version that he performs with Larry Coryell at the meeting, on the Meeting of the Spirits video, the live footage from, I think, the Royal Albert Hall or Royal Festival Hall, one of those. And that version is beautiful because it's just acoustic, 2 acoustic guitars. The version on here, in terms of on album, this is the most satisfying version of Lotus Feet that you will find. An album that many John McLaughlin fans don't know about is Monum, and another soundtrack album that he played on, although he wasn't the composer of it, which is absolutely fantastic, and also gives you another view into John McLaughlin, is the soundtrack album for the film Round Midnight. Now, Round Midnight is perhaps the greatest film about jazz ever made. Made by Bertrand Tavernier, who is obviously a French film director. It sort of creates a fictional character played by the great Dexter Gordon, which is an amalgamation of a number of different American jazz musicians who sort of went to France, where they would be greater, you know, they would be more appreciated. The preeminent one probably being Bud Powell, who suffered with mental health issues and was looked after by this guy whilst he was there. And this film follows the story of that French guy looking after Bud Powell, although rather than being a pianist, this guy, Dexter Gordon, is a saxophone player. Dexter Gordon, of course, was one of those musicians who went out to Europe along with Sonny Stitt. There was a whole host of them. In fact, in the 70s, they made an excellent documentary that had on video, which was called Jazz in Europe. And it was brilliant, and it covered a lot of these artists at the time. So there's a lot of interviews with these musicians. So this is a very interesting aspect of jazz. You know, jazz was first appreciated in France, and the Hot Club of France is perhaps the first international jazz group which is equal to the American jazz group. So this is an important area. Now, Bertrand Tavernier approaches the material in a brilliant way, bringing in lots of jazz musicians and filming in these sort of sets that are a set of like a jazz club. But when they're playing and acting, they are really playing. And that's what makes this so great. When you watch something like Bird that Clint Eastwood made, it's a great film about Charlie Parker, but obviously, what's his name? Is it Forrest Whitaker? The guy who's playing Charlie Parker. He's having to mime to Charlie Parker's solos. They actually, in some cases, got old solos and stripped them off the tape and then got people to play alongside. And then, of course, the musicians are miming. So you all get that thing that you always get with jazz films where they're playing and it doesn't seem quite right. It's not quite real. It doesn't matter how accurately they've done it. It doesn't seem quite real. This film's not like that. Now, the soundtrack here is, which was made in around about 86, is a who's who of jazz musicians, great jazz musicians of the last 50 years. We've got Herbie Hancock on here, Ron Carter's on here, Tony Williams on here, Bobby McFerrin's on vocals on here. We also have Billy Higgins on drums, and of course John McLaughlin cropping up on a number of tunes, including Body and Soul. So we get to hear what John was originally, which is a straight down the line Tal Farlow influenced jazz guitarist, and he plays incredible on here. We've got Wayne Shorter on here. Lynette McKee is a vocalist that turns up. She's in the film as well, singing. Cedar Walton's on here. Dexter Gordon, obviously. I should have mentioned him up front. Did I mention him? This is a wonderful album. There was another album made by these musicians that sort of, where they made another jazz album, just a straight jazz album in the recording studio. I haven't got that album, and I'm not too sure where John McLaughlin's on that. Anyway, we are now at, that was number 8. So I've got John McLaughlin out the way and his 2 forays into film soundtrack making. Now, there is this sort of mythical album that John McLaughlin may have made that was another soundtrack album that has not ever come out. Now, I don't know whether this is apocryphal, mythical, whether I dreamt it or not, but there is an idea that that exists out in the world somewhere. Does it? Does anyone know about that? I've heard whispers of it in the forest. Right, shall we move on to number 7? And at number 7, I've got this album, which is Apocalypse Now. Now, this, obviously, one of the greatest films ever made. And this was created by, I believe, and I'm going to have to just check this, by Francis Ford Coppola's father, who is called Carmine Coppola, and was a film composer in the sort of classic Hollywood era. Now, this is interesting in that this, for me, I've always seen this album here as being an electronica experimental album. The soundtrack to Apocalypse Now was made using electronic instruments, synthesizers, electronic treatment, studio techniques. Carmine Coppola oversees a group of quite incredible musicians that sadly aren't listed, I believe, on the album. But I know that Airto Morari was involved in this on percussion. This, for me, people have, they're fans of all sorts of electronic albums. And, you know, people like Tangerine Dream and they love Kraftwerk, and I love all that as well. But for me, this was always a monumental electronic album. It also has a couple of tunes on it. We've got Ride of the Valkyries by Wagner, the famous sequence with Robert Duvall when they come in with the helicopters. We've got Susie Q on here, and of course, we have The End by The Doors, which augments that, the end sequence as our hero goes to kill Colonel Kurtz. It's an incredible film. The soundtrack album, I believe, stands up on its own. It's interesting to hear tracks like Susie Q emerge out of this, and they seem to have been treated in a way which they fit in almost as found objects into this electronic soundtrack. I haven't pulled any soundtrack albums that are just compilations of different tracks. That's almost like another video. There's a whole bunch of albums I can pick like that, or I haven't really picked like, Tommy, the soundtrack to Tommy or anything like that. I've tried to go to actual soundtracks. This one cheats a little bit because we do have those 3 songs on here, but it all blends into an album which I find very compelling as a piece of work on its own. Right, the purists are going to hate this, but this is the album I would go for. Ennio Morricone, one of the great composers on film of the 20th century. And he did all sorts of stuff. My favourite soundtrack by him is probably from The Mission, which is an orchestral soundtrack, very moving. And I would probably go for that if I owned it, but I don't own it. And if I did own it, I wouldn't then get all that sort of proto early rock electric twangy guitar madness harmonica stuff that exists on the incredible spaghetti western soundtracks. Most notably, that would be A Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West. And what I'm offering here, because it brings them all together, is an album called The Best of Ennio Morricone, which basically pulls together all those spaghetti western stuff. And what's genius about this is that Morricone has a vision which is unlike the sort of Hollywood idea of how a soundtrack should operate. And it's much more based upon signifiers, almost like you would hear in a cartoon film. There's a reaction to what's going on screen, and certain sounds and certain themes are related to certain characters. In these films, the Leone films, the characters are all very dubious and opaque morally. There's no real good guys and no real bad guys. It sort of plays out on a level which is quite strange. And so with these characters that have no names, that seem to, we don't know whose side we're on and who's in them, has the moral high ground there, the music anchors this and gives it a sort of, it gives it a sound which when you see the characters, you know who they are. It grounds those characters. It also definitely differentiates, the soundtrack definitely differentiates these films from the American Western. And that's why the spaghetti Westerns were so important, because suddenly in the 1960s, we'd got the sort of American genre films being now transported into Europe, and then that opened up the doors for all sorts of films to start to be made. And I think of, the sort of Dario Argento horror films, which of course those Goblin soundtracks are great, but I don't own them, you see. And a lot of these films have incredible soundtracks. So I don't know what to say about Morricone. I think he was an absolute genius. His music is unlike anybody else's, and his use of the electric guitar in the early to mid 60s can be seen as being as iconic as Eric Clapton, on the Beano album, or a couple of years later, Hendrix coming out and doing Purple Haze. It was an incredible use of stinging, nasty rock and roll electric guitar. Right, I'm going to now move on to, I think I'm on number 5. Yeah, I'm on number 5. We are now going to get the first of 2 David Cronenberg film soundtracks. I like David Cronenberg. I think he's an incredible filmmaker. He has often worked with the composer Howard Shore. Now, Howard Shore then became famous as the composer for the Lord of the Rings film, where he produced something that was much more nearer a standard Hollywood soundtrack. Peter Jackson obviously pulled Howard Shore in because of the Cronenberg films. Obviously, it was a big horror film. And on the Cronenberg films, it's a lot more out there and angular. If you watch the special features of the Lord of the Rings films, when Frodo goes into the lair of Shelob, Howard Shore then goes into full Cronenberg mode, and you start to get this much more angular, disturbing, body horror, visceral, sort of icy composing that I like very much. I think Howard Shore's a great composer. There's a couple of soundtracks that absolutely blow me away, and this is a brilliant album. This is the soundtrack to Naked Lunch. This is an orchestral, angular soundtrack that depicts very brilliantly that sort of parallel reality combined with that sort of beat culture vibe that is in this film. Hallucinogenic, strange, exotic. Now, of course, Burroughs went out to see the master musicians of Jajouka, and I believe he took with him Ornette Coleman, and Ornette Coleman came along and improvised. And Ornette Coleman's sound can be seen as sort of personifying that beatnik era. And Howard Shore has the genius of this, of bringing in Ornette Coleman. So as you can see, it's credited to both Howard Shore and Ornette Coleman. And Ornette Coleman just reacts to the orchestra. That harmonic process, he stands over it like a great singer playing, like Ella Fitzgerald played with, those lush Nelson Riddle arrangements. But this time it's Howard Shore and Ornette Coleman. And for me, it's one of Ornette's greatest moments. It's a brilliant and accessible way for Ornette Coleman. The reason is because when you watch the film and you drop into that sort of trippy William Burroughs-esque Naked Lunch, hallucinogenic drug, and all debauchery, all that thing that's in there, and Ornette's sound comes in, you are forced to approach Ornette in a different way that you would approach any jazz musician that had gone before. It really makes sense. The orchestrations are beautiful, and Ornette Coleman's sound just sits in it. And for me, who always finds, written music, classical music, film soundtrack music, a little limiting, because as you know, I am a very strong adherent to improvisation. And I think improvisation is a key creatively. And in classical, I always feel like that's missing. To have this, one of the greatest free improvisers of all time, just jamming over something that's written orchestral, provides something that is quite magnificent. Now, Ornette tried to do this with pieces like Skies of America in the 1970s, where he brought in an orchestra. I've had a problem getting my words out today. And that's great, but you really feel like it's like the band, his primetime band, and then the orchestra, the band and the orchestra. It's a thing that always crops up. This idea of just having Ornette on his own is quite brilliant. There is a little bit of jazz on here. where you hear the sort of primetime band, I believe, with Donato on drums. He also does a tune by Thelonious Monk, Mysterioso. This really is a brilliant soundtrack album, which is why it's come up so high. What could be high at that, number 4? I have a massive soft spot for John Barry, and I think I would love to own all that stuff he did for the Harry Palmer films, the Ipcris file, where you get that very unique harmonic approach that John Barry had that then combines with his way he voices for strings, which has a very recognizable attribute to it. Of course, John Barry was involved in many of the Bond films, and the Bond films are iconic, and you recognize a Bond film because of the sound of the strings. John Barry has that, and I love that sound. On the Ipcris file, he also brings in things like zithers and strange instruments into the mix. And I just absolutely love it. I really love it. I don't own the soundtrack to the Ipcris file. I really should go and get it. The only soundtrack album I have by John Barry is this one, Out of Africa. Now, I bought this because on this, he does something else. This is where John Barry portrays the sort of open plains of Africa. And he does that in the music. And that's feeling of the heat and the open plains and the sort of this story that plays out, which is like a love story. This is Barry at his sort of most orchestral, beautiful. And I absolutely love the sound of the orchestra. This is above most classical music for me in terms of orchestral music. It's absolutely wonderful. It also contains the Concerto for Clarinet and Orchestra in A by Mozart. So it's not all John Barry, I have to say that. Great album. I wish I could tell you more about this album, but I can't. But it's absolutely wonderful. I bought it many, many years ago, 40 years ago. As a youngster, interested in orchestral music, but not knowing where to go, and ending up with John Barry. We're down to the final 3 now. At number 3, I have another Cronenberg film, another score by Howard Shore. And it's this one, Crash. This is absolutely incredible. When I went to see Naked Lunch, I obviously being a big fan of Ornette Coleman, I was like, whoa, this is Ornette Coleman, sat in the cinema listening to Ornette, with all these people. I thought, this is amazing. And I thought, I've got to go and buy that. I'm an Ornette Coleman fan. I've got to go and buy that. So I went out and bought it. That's why I bought it. With this one, I bought it just because the soundtrack was so incredible. Now, of course, Crash is a very controversial film. It doesn't get talked about that much. It's about people who become sexually aroused when they are in car crashes. Very strange and disturbing. Now, this film is like a film soundtrack, and it has a full orchestral sort of arrangement, except the orchestra is made up of guitars, and guitars that have their sort of sound rooted in Sonic Youth and most similar. It sounds like the incredible work of Glenn Branca. Now, I'm a big fan of Glenn Branca. I haven't got any of his albums, but in the late 80s, early 90s, I had a couple of Glenn Branca albums. He would create these big sort of orchestral pieces for stinging, like indie punk guitar. And Howard Shore takes that idea and he creates something that's really, really interesting. Now, this music's unlike anything else. Of course, with these soundtracks, they never have the musicians on here. It tells me who's starring in the film, but I don't know who the guitarists are. I don't know how he went about it. I wish I could tell you more about it, and I can't. This is not a field of expertise for me, so I can't tell you how it was done and who played on it. I often wonder whether Glenn Branca was involved in this. And my eyes are too bad to be able to read the credits on the back, I'm afraid, to see if his name... I mean, who could read that? I mean, look at that red writing. There's no way I could read that. This is a monumental. This is the one where I'm telling you, nobody's going to talk about this album. Go and check it out. It's an incredible album. Right, we're down to the final two. At number two, I have who is possibly my favourite film composer, which is Bernard Herrmann. I do have an album of various different Herrmann soundtrack stuff for Citizen Kane, The Devil and Daniel Webster, the stuff he did for Hitchcock, like Psycho, Vertigo, and the stuff he did for Harryhausen, the incredible score for Jason and the Argonauts. This is all incredible stuff. Bernard Herrmann really had the psychology of a modern classical composer, and he would pull in elements from outside, which sometimes, not always, were pulling from very modern approaches. On the soundtrack to The Devil and Daniel Webster, he actually recorded the sound of electronic, electricity cables out in the desert, which were making this whirring sound, and he brought that into the soundtrack, thus creating the first electronic soundtrack for any film. He's famous, of course, with Psycho, to scoring that entirely from strings, and of course there's been much written about the idea that when you hear those strings, you picture the violin, and the violin has, of course, the sort of female body, and then with the F holes in, which looks like where somebody stabbed. There's been much written about that. The soundtrack album I've actually got is this one. His final soundtrack for Taxi Driver. An incredible film, of course. An incredible soundtrack. And this really does give Taxi Driver an edge, I think, when you watch it. Bernard Herrmann descends you into a world that we've never heard before or since. He sort of explores this idea of cocktail jazz mixed with harsh modern classical performances. Now, I do hope we have some sort of lineup on this album of who played on it, because of course there's that incredible saxophone melody that I believed was played by Tom Scott. Now, I think the last time, but they don't do this on soundtrack albums. I mean, we've got some notes, but we don't have any idea of who played on it. So without checking it here, we're going to have to assume it's Tom Scott. I don't know, to be honest. Arranged and conducted by David Bloom, and then some of it has been composed and conducted by Bernard Herrmann. We do get that excellent Travis Bickle. Are you looking at me? That's wonderful, isn't it, though? I mean, that's worth not knowing who's on the bloody album, isn't it? Herrmann got the Oscar for this, I believe. By the time the Oscars came out, he was dead. It was his last soundtrack. I don't think he even saw the release of the film. I don't know what he thought about it. It was a different take to the sort of films he normally worked on. Scorsese was a young upstart at that point. It's a pretty violent film and dark film, dealing with child prostitution and all that type of stuff. So I don't know what he thought of all that, but I've always felt that there's a sound on this album which is absolutely unique. Absolutely unique. The musical pieces are like fragments, as though at this point in Herrmann's career, it's like sketches. This is all you need. That sort of melody that comes through, and that's all you need, and that's that bit. That's obviously, as a theme, is representing Sybil Shepherd, that little bit of beauty that's in his life. Right, so we're at number one. This is without doubt my favourite soundtrack. This is one of the greatest albums ever made. It is, of course, the soundtrack to one of the greatest films ever made. I'm obsessed with this film and this soundtrack. I really am. As a kid, I saw this film late one night, and I couldn't believe what I was watching. I'm not going to keep you in suspense anymore. It's Philip Glass's soundtrack to Koyaanisqatsi. Now, if you haven't seen Koyaanisqatsi, it was made between 79 and 83. It took about 4 years to make. It was made by Godfrey Reggio, who was a very spiritual person, a monk, I believe, who had who had studied these hoppy Indian sort of premonitions, what would you call it? Foretelling what could be the future. Drop the album. And it tells a story of mankind developing and then destroying itself through, you know, sort of environmental disaster. An incredible film when you think when it was made. And he tells the story of this through stop motion, very, very fast stop motion film of people, cities, and it's almost become a cliche, this has. And incredible vistas. It's just an incredible film. When he made it, he asked the great Philip Glass. Now, I am a massive fan of minimalism. I have decided to do a video on it, or a series of videos at some point. The reason why I haven't up until now is because I know the views will be terrible for this. Steve Reich is my favourite composer of the 20th century. I think he's an absolute genius. Philip Glass has a much more, I would say, more commercial aspect, and his influence on rock music has been greater, I think. And that is because he's very emotive. He can emote brilliantly within the simple frameworks that he sets up. And Koyaanisqatsi, for me, is his greatest piece. Don't know whether that's because I saw it with the film. I don't know where to start with this film. I was probably about 14, 15. I'm staying up one night and this film starts up. And it's just stop motion. And I'm watching it, but the music's incredible. And the music's drawing me in and it's spinning me off. It's almost hallucinogenic what's happening. And you've got this footage, you know, you're seeing, you know, shooting across, you know, the deserts in America. And then we're in cities, we're seeing production lines, and then it shoots to someone's face up close. And all this stuff's happening. Now, if you watch that film and sit down with it, it tells a story. It's got a narrative. It's like the whole history of mankind. It's all there. And it drops you in such a place at the end. And I won't spoil it, but the final sequence really points out the brilliant achievements of mankind and the folly of mankind all in one. Now, when Philip Glass created this, he created compositions which acted under their own steam. I've been a little bit involved in creating soundtracks for plays and films to some extent. And they'll ask you to do the piece. You write the piece, you get it great, then you give it to them. And then they go, it's really good, but that needs to be 3 minutes longer and that needs to be shorter. Again, you take that out because I didn't like that. And you're like going, no, I can't, because that's it. I get really annoyed. I'm no good at it. To be able to get a minimalist piece into a film, a minimalist piece, which usually these are operating on processes that take a certain amount of time to develop. You can't just cut 2 minutes out of a minimalist piece. You'd think you could, but you can't, because minimalism is based upon this slow cadence. It's putting things into process, into mechanism that hold your interest, because you are aware of this gestalt feeling that the piece is moving slowly and inexorably from one place to another, and then maybe even back. I think Steve Rice was the genius of developing this idea. So Godfrey Reggio, the director, cut the film around the soundtrack. It's jaw-dropping. And so when you put this album is like an incredible album. If you haven't got any Philip Glass and you want to know what to get, you think, shall I get North Star, because that's the famous one? Go and get this. This is without doubt my favourite piece. The arrangement's incredible, and he has this sort of choir on there, and they chant this sort of Koyaanisqatsi, you know, aphorism, Koyaanisqatsi, and that opening up tune with those, that what sounds like a church organ, the bass notes moving. This is absolutely incredible. So those are my favourite soundtrack albums in my collection. I was able to impart some knowledge on some of them. I wasn't so good on the other ones. You know, there's questions. Maybe you can fill in the gaps for me. Before I go, there is one album that I really wanted to put on this list, and I didn't. I'm going to hold it up here. Yeah, I can't, because it's not a soundtrack album. It is The Big Duck Gun Down, where John Zorn plays the music of Ennio Morricone. This is wonderful, right? No one should do cover versions of Ennio Morricone. It's only going to be worse, especially where the arrangements are so important. Zorn comes along and rearranges them, and it's just wonderful. What he does on here is absolutely wonderful. One of Zorn's great albums, a brilliant example of Ennio Morricone. So if you're an Ennio Morricone fan, that's an essential purchase. Right, so look what I've been talking about on this video. You know the mainstream aren't interested in any of this. You do know that, don't you? And so this isn't going to do well at all. I've talked about so much esoteric stuff here. They have to understand my channel's getting big. I'm coming up to 60,000 subscribers, and I'm not doing videos on Pink Floyd or Genesis. I'm doing videos and trying to do videos on deep philosophical conundrums, aesthetic conundrums, and talking about music that no one else talks about. That's what I want to have. I want there to be a video for every single artist out there, you know, from and across all the genres. I don't want to be an elitist, but I want to get into the nooks and crannies. And so some of them might come here and watch that and go, oh, I'm going to check out that John Zorn album. I'll go and get that. That's so important to me. I'm saying this seriously here. This is what I'm trying to do. And I've got a big audience. Now, the main audience, the ones who dial up, I did a couple of days ago, the 10 most arrogant musicians. Those, I love doing them. They're comedy stuff. You know, this channel is me doing comedy videos about music. And underlying it at the esoteric heart is me talking about some of the heaviest music that's ever made. And I love that those two things exist at the same time. So I'm very aware that in doing a video like this, it probably won't get the views. You know, it'll open up a couple of hours later. I'll be opening up YouTube and it'll say, this video is not doing so well, Andy. Your subscribers aren't clicking on it or whatever it says. It always gives you a sort of, you know, tells you where you've gone wrong. And that's usually mine. My subscribers have not clicked on it. If you're a music fan and you're not a subscriber, if you're into this weird music, if you listen to ABBA and then listen to Ennio Morricone, then listen to John Zorn, then listen to John McLaughlin, and then listen to Stravinsky, if that's the type of guy you are, or girl, lady, woman, please subscribe. Click it now, because I know the views will be low, but if you all subscribe, this will change the way YouTube works. All right? And it will be going, oh, I know less people watch this, but the ones who do watch it love it. No one else is doing this, and they are watching it to the end. So this is why I always put my message at the end for the subscribers. If someone's been on it for 5 minutes, you ask them to subscribe, they think, I just really watch this bloke, I don't even know who he is. But if you got to the end, you must have enjoyed this, or be a regular viewer. So that's me selling it. Of course, I have a Patreon. I have a members group here. I have a PayPal tip jar. I also have a Bandcamp and a Substack. Not doing so much on the Substack. I will, don't worry. Don't worry. I will. So we're done. That's that video out the way. I can now go and do something like the greatest elbows in heavy metal. You know, something that will get them in watching. Thank you very much. See you on the next one.